There are stories that begin with answers, where every detail fits into place and every event can be explained, and then there are stories like this one, stories that refuse to be understood, no matter how many years pass, no matter how many investigations are conducted, stories that remain suspended between fact and mystery, where every answer only leads to more questions, and where the truth, no matter how close it seems, never fully reveals itself. In the winter of 1959, deep within the remote and unforgiving landscape of the Ural Mountains, a group of 9 experienced hikers set out on an expedition that should have been difficult, but not impossible, challenging but not fatal, because these were not amateurs. They were trained, disciplined, and fully aware of the risks that came with crossing such terrain in the middle of winter. The leader of the group was Igor Dyatlov, a young but highly respected student who had already completed multiple long-distance expeditions under extreme conditions, someone who understood the mountains, someone who knew how to survive in environments where even a small mistake could have serious consequences. And yet, even with that experience, even with that preparation, something happened on that journey that no one has ever been able to fully explain. The group consisted of students and graduates from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, each one carefully selected, each one physically prepared, each one carrying the knowledge and discipline required for a journey of this scale, and together they formed a team that should have been capable of handling almost anything the mountain could throw at them. Their goal was clear: to reach a remote peak known as Otorten, a route that required endurance, coordination, and careful planning, but nothing beyond their abilities, nothing that suggested danger beyond what they had already faced before. At the beginning, everything went according to plan. They departed by train, traveling deep into the northern regions, moving further away from civilization with every passing hour, until they reached the last point accessible by vehicle, a small settlement where the real journey would begin, a place where the road ended and the wilderness took over. From there, they continued on foot, carrying heavy equipment, supplies, and everything they would need to survive in temperatures that could drop far below freezing, conditions where the cold was not just uncomfortable but dangerous, where exposure alone could become fatal if not managed carefully. But they were prepared. Or at least they believed they were. As the group moved deeper into the mountains, the terrain became more difficult, the weather more unpredictable, and the conditions more extreme, but still, nothing suggested that something was wrong, nothing indicated that this journey would become anything more than a challenging expedition. Then one of the members turned back. Not because of fear. Not because of danger. But because of illness. A young man named Yuri Yudin began to feel unwell, his body unable to continue under the strain of the journey, and after a difficult decision he separated from the group, turning back toward civilization while the others continued forward. At the time, it seemed like a simple moment, a practical decision made out of necessity. No one could have known that this would make him the only survivor. The remaining 9 hikers continued their journey, pushing forward into deeper isolation, where the mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, where the wind moved across the open slopes without obstruction, and where the temperature continued to fall as night approached. They documented their progress carefully, taking photographs, writing in journals, recording small details of the journey, moments that now serve as the last pieces of evidence of what their experience had been like before everything changed. The images show a group that appears calm, focused, even relaxed at times, smiling despite the harsh conditions, supporting each other, working together, exactly as expected from a team of experienced hikers. There was no panic, no visible fear, no sign that anything was about to go wrong. And that is what makes what happened next so difficult to understand. On the evening of February 1st, the group made a decision that investigators would later question repeatedly, a decision that may have played a critical role in what followed, because instead of descending to a more sheltered area, they chose to set up their tent on an exposed slope of a mountain known as Kholat Syakhl. The name itself carried a meaning that would later add to the mystery. It translates to Dead Mountain. At the time it was just a name, a geographical detail, nothing more. They pitched their tent on the slope, cutting into the snow to create a flat surface, securing it against the wind, and preparing for the night in conditions that were far from comfortable but still within their ability to manage. Inside that tent, they ate, rested, and prepared to sleep, unaware that this would be their last night together. And then, sometime during the night, something happened. Something sudden. Something powerful enough to force 9 experienced hikers to abandon everything they had. Because what investigators found later would not make sense. The tent was still there. But it had been cut open. From the inside. Not carefully. Not methodically. But quickly. Desperately. As if whatever had caused them to leave had given them no time to think, no time to plan, no time to act in any controlled way. They had escaped. Not exited. And they had done it without proper clothing, without shoes, without the equipment they needed to survive even a short time in that environment. Which means one thing: whatever happened inside that tent was worse than the freezing cold outside. And that is where the mystery begins. When the search teams finally reached the area where the group had last been expected to camp, there was no immediate sign of disaster, no obvious indication that anything catastrophic had taken place, only the vast empty silence of the mountain stretching in every direction, untouched and indifferent, as if nothing unusual had ever happened there. But that silence did not last long, because as they moved closer to the slope where the hikers had set up their tent, the first signs of something deeply wrong began to appear. The tent was found partially buried under snow, still standing, still anchored to the ground, but what immediately stood out was not its position or condition, it was the way it had been opened, because instead of an entrance being used, the fabric had been cut from the inside, slashed open in multiple places, creating exits that had clearly been made in a hurry, not with precision or care, but with urgency, with desperation, as if the people inside had not been trying to leave in an orderly way but to escape as quickly as possible. And that single detail changed everything. Because experienced hikers do not abandon their shelter in freezing conditions without a reason, and they certainly do not destroy their only protection against the cold unless whatever is inside the tent has become more dangerous than the environment outside it. The searchers began to follow the tracks leading away from the tent, faint impressions in the snow that had been partially preserved by the cold, and what they saw next only made the situation more difficult to understand, because the footprints did not show signs of chaos, they were not scattered or erratic, they moved in a consistent direction, descending the slope toward a wooded area below, as if the group had left together, not running blindly, but moving with a strange kind of order even though everything about the situation suggested panic. And yet something was missing. There were no signs of a struggle near the tent, no evidence of another group, no indication that anyone had chased them or forced them out, only the quiet trail of their own footprints leading away from the place where they should have been safe. The search teams followed those tracks carefully, step by step, moving down the slope until they reached the edge of the forest, where the first bodies were found. Two of the hikers lay beneath a large cedar tree, their bodies positioned close together, as if they had tried to stay near each other for warmth, but what was immediately clear was that they had not been properly dressed, their clothing incomplete, insufficient for the conditions they had been exposed to, and the signs on their bodies suggested that they had attempted to survive, broken branches above them indicating that they had tried to climb the tree, perhaps to look for something or to escape something. A small fire had been made nearby, the remains of it still visible, evidence that they had not simply collapsed, but had tried to endure, had tried to stay alive despite the cold that would have been overwhelming without proper protection. Further along the path, more bodies were discovered, scattered between the tree line and the slope, each one telling part of a story that still refused to come together, because some appeared to have been moving back toward the tent, as if they had realized that leaving it had been a mistake, as if they had tried to return but never made it. And then there were the others. The remaining 4 were not found immediately, and it would take months before they were discovered, buried under deep snow in a nearby ravine, and when their bodies were finally uncovered, the mystery took a darker turn, because their injuries were not like the others. These were not the marks of exposure. These were something else. Severe internal trauma. Crushed ribs. Fractured skulls. Injuries that, according to investigators, resembled the kind of damage seen in high-impact accidents, and yet there were no external wounds to match, no visible signs of what could have caused such force, no clear explanation of how those injuries had occurred in an environment where nothing seemed capable of producing them. And that contradiction would become one of the most disturbing aspects of the entire case, because it suggested that whatever had happened to them was not simple, not natural, not easily explained. Some of the clothing found on the bodies added another layer of confusion, because pieces of clothing appeared to have been removed from some individuals and worn by others, suggesting that those who had survived longer had tried to use whatever they could to protect themselves, a desperate attempt to adapt, to survive, to hold on for as long as possible. But even that did not fully explain the sequence of events. Why leave the tent in the first place? Why without proper clothing? Why in the middle of the night? Why in conditions they fully understood? The investigators returned again and again to the same question, trying to reconstruct what had happened during those final hours, trying to find a sequence that made sense, a chain of events that could explain each decision, each movement, each outcome, but every attempt led to the same conclusion. Something was missing. Something that had not been seen. Something that had not been recorded. The official conclusion would later suggest that the group had died as a result of a compelling natural force, a phrase that sounded definitive but explained nothing, a statement that closed the case without truly answering it, leaving behind more uncertainty than clarity. Because what kind of force could cause experienced hikers to cut their way out of a tent, walk into freezing darkness without protection, separate from each other, and suffer injuries that could not be easily explained by the environment alone? That question would remain unanswered. And the deeper investigators looked, the more the case seemed to move away from simple explanations, drifting instead into a space where logic and evidence no longer aligned, where each new detail raised more questions than it resolved. There were no witnesses, no clear timeline, no definitive cause, only fragments, evidence that pointed in different directions, details that did not fit together, and a story that refused to settle into anything that could be easily understood. Because whatever happened on that mountain that night was not something ordinary, and it was not something that would be forgotten. As investigators tried to piece together what had happened on that mountain, the case began to move beyond simple reconstruction and into something far more uncertain, because every attempt to explain the events logically only created new contradictions, and instead of forming a clear picture, the evidence seemed to pull in different directions, forcing those involved to consider possibilities that went beyond ordinary explanations. At first, the most straightforward theory was that of an avalanche, a sudden collapse of snow that could have forced the group to abandon their tent in a panic, explaining why they had cut their way out instead of using the entrance. But the more this theory was examined, the more it began to fall apart, because the slope where the tent had been set up was not steep enough to support a large avalanche, and more importantly, the tent itself was still partially standing, not crushed, not buried, in the way it would have been if such a force had passed over it. There were no clear signs of massive snow displacement, no deep layers of compacted snow that would have indicated a powerful slide, and yet the behavior of the group suggested a sudden and urgent threat, something that had forced them to act immediately, without hesitation, without preparation. Then there was the possibility of a natural phenomenon that did not leave obvious physical traces, something less visible but equally powerful, such as infrasound, a type of low-frequency vibration that can affect the human body in unexpected ways, creating feelings of unease, panic, and even irrational fear, a phenomenon that has been studied but not fully understood, and one that could, in theory, explain why a group of experienced hikers might suddenly feel the need to escape their shelter. But even that explanation had limits, because while it could account for panic, it could not explain the physical injuries found on some of the bodies, injuries that required significant force, injuries that suggested something far more direct and physical had taken place. Other theories pointed toward human involvement, the possibility that the group had encountered another presence on the mountain, perhaps military personnel conducting secret tests, or individuals who did not want to be seen. And while this idea carried a certain logic, especially given the time period and the remote location, there was no clear evidence to support it, no footprints other than those of the hikers, no signs of conflict, no indication that anyone else had been there. And yet, the mention of military activity did not disappear completely, because some of the clothing recovered from the bodies showed traces of radiation, a detail that immediately raised questions, not just about what the group had encountered, but about what might have been happening in the area at the time, because radiation does not simply appear without a source. Explanations were offered, suggesting that some of the hikers had previously worked in environments where radioactive materials were present, meaning the contamination could have come from earlier exposure, but this did not fully satisfy those who were trying to understand the larger picture, because once again, it added another layer without removing any of the existing confusion. Then there were the injuries, the most difficult part of the case to explain. Some of the hikers had died from hypothermia, their bodies showing the expected signs of prolonged exposure to extreme cold, but others had suffered severe internal damage, injuries that resembled those seen in high-impact collisions, and yet there were no external wounds to match, no broken skin, no visible trauma that would normally accompany such force. It was as if the damage had been inflicted from within. And that detail led to even more questions. What could create that kind of force in such an isolated environment? What could cause such injuries without leaving clear evidence behind? Some investigators suggested that the group may have fallen into the ravine where the last bodies were found, that the injuries could have been the result of a fall onto hard, uneven ground covered by snow, but even that explanation did not fully align with the severity and nature of the damage. Others pointed towards something more unusual, something less grounded in conventional reasoning, theories that involved unknown entities, unexplained forces, or encounters that could not be easily categorized, ideas that moved the case further away from traditional investigation and into the realm of speculation. And while those theories could not be proven, they continued to exist, fueled by the gaps in the evidence, by the details that refused to fit into any single explanation. Photographs taken during the expedition added to the mystery, particularly one image that appeared to show a distant figure standing on the snow, a shape that could not be clearly identified, leading some to suggest that the group had not been alone, that there had been something else out there with them, watching, waiting, or perhaps even approaching. But like so many elements of the case, that image remained inconclusive, open to interpretation, impossible to confirm. And so the investigation continued to circle the same unanswered questions, returning again and again to the moment inside the tent, trying to understand what had happened in that single critical period of time when everything changed. Because whatever had occurred, it had been powerful enough to override training, experience, and instinct, forcing 9 people to make a decision that would ultimately lead to their deaths. A decision that made no sense. Unless the alternative was worse. That possibility, more than anything else, is what kept the case alive, because it suggests that the group was not simply reacting to danger, but to something they believed was immediate, unavoidable, and more threatening than the freezing darkness outside. And yet, even with all the theories, all the analysis, and all the years that have passed, the truth remains just out of reach, not hidden completely but never fully revealed, existing somewhere between what is known and what can only be imagined. Because some mysteries do not end with answers. They remain unresolved. And this is one of them. As the years passed and the case remained unresolved, it slowly transformed from an active investigation into something more enduring, something that refused to disappear despite the absence of clear answers. And with time came new perspectives, new methods, and new attempts to understand what had happened on that mountain, not by relying only on the limited tools available in 1959, but by re-examining the evidence through the lens of modern science and analysis. One of the most significant developments came decades later, when investigators and researchers began to revisit the case with a renewed focus on environmental factors, particularly the possibility that a specific type of avalanche, smaller and more localized than previously considered, could have played a role, a phenomenon sometimes referred to as a slab avalanche, where a layer of snow separates and slides down with enough force to create danger without leaving the kind of large-scale destruction typically associated with avalanches. This theory suggested that the group may have felt the snow shifting beneath them, a subtle but terrifying movement that signaled an imminent collapse, forcing them to act quickly, to leave the tent before it could be buried, and in that moment of urgency, they may have cut their way out rather than risk becoming trapped. But even this explanation did not fully resolve the mystery because while it could account for the initial panic, it did not explain why they moved so far from the tent without returning, nor did it fully account for the severe injuries found on some of the bodies, injuries that required more than a simple fall or collapse. Another modern approach focused on the role of wind and sound, particularly the possibility that specific wind patterns in mountainous terrain could create infrasound, low-frequency vibrations capable of affecting the human body and mind, potentially inducing feelings of fear, anxiety, and disorientation, a phenomenon that could have influenced the group's decision-making in ways that were not entirely rational. According to this theory, the combination of wind conditions and terrain may have created a situation where the hikers experienced a sudden and overwhelming sense of danger, prompting them to leave the tent without fully understanding why, reacting not to a visible threat, but to a psychological one. And yet, once again, this explanation could not stand on its own, because while it might explain panic, it could not explain the physical evidence, the injuries, the sequence of events that followed after they left the tent. Some researchers turned their attention to the ravine where the last bodies were found, analyzing the terrain in detail, reconstructing how a fall into that area could have caused the internal injuries observed, suggesting that the depth of the snow may have concealed uneven surfaces, rocks, and natural formations capable of inflicting significant damage upon impact. In this version of events, the hikers leave the tent in response to a perceived threat, possibly a small avalanche or shifting snow. They descend the slope together, attempting to reach the forest where they could find shelter, build a fire, and regroup. Some remain near the tree trying to survive the cold, while others attempt to return to the tent to retrieve their equipment, but the conditions, the darkness, and the temperature make that journey impossible. Meanwhile, a smaller group moves toward the ravine, perhaps in search of better shelter, only to suffer fatal injuries in a fall, leaving the remaining members unable to help, unable to recover, and ultimately unable to survive. It is a theory that connects many of the known facts, that explains behavior that once seemed irrational, and that aligns with the physical evidence more closely than earlier explanations. But even this does not answer everything. Because there are still details that do not fit perfectly, still questions that remain unresolved, still elements that seem just slightly out of place, as if something important is missing from the narrative. Why was the tent cut open instead of simply exited? Why did some of the hikers remove or share clothing in ways that are difficult to fully explain? Why were there traces of radiation? Why did certain details appear inconsistent across different reports? These are not small questions. They are central to the mystery, and they prevent any single theory from being accepted as complete. In recent years, official investigations have revisited the case once again, applying modern techniques, conducting new analyses, and attempting to reach a more definitive conclusion. And while these efforts have leaned toward natural explanations, particularly those involving environmental conditions and terrain, they have also acknowledged the limitations of those conclusions, recognizing that not every detail can be fully explained with the information available. Not entirely unsolved, but not entirely resolved. Existing in a space where science provides part of the answer, but not all of it, where evidence supports certain conclusions but leaves others open, where the truth feels close but never complete. Because sometimes, even when we understand how something might have happened, we still cannot fully understand why it happened the way it did. And that distinction matters. The Dyatlov Pass incident has become more than just a case, more than just a historical event. It has become a symbol of the limits of investigation, a reminder that even with evidence, even with technology, even with time, there are moments that remain beyond full comprehension. And perhaps that is what makes it so enduring, so difficult to let go of, because it challenges the idea that everything can be explained, that every mystery has a clear answer waiting to be discovered. Because sometimes the answer exists, but it is incomplete. And sometimes, that is the closest we can get to the truth. But understanding how something might have happened is not the same as knowing exactly what happened. Because there is still no single moment that explains everything. No definitive trigger. No clear event that answers every question at once. And that absence is what keeps the mystery alive. For others, the unanswered details leave room for something more, possibilities that go beyond conventional explanations, theories that explore the unknown, not because they can be proven, but because the gaps in the story make them possible. And somewhere between those perspectives lies the reality of the case, not fully resolved, not completely open, but existing in a space where both explanation and mystery coexist. The mountain itself remains unchanged, silent, indifferent. A place that does not remember what happened, that does not reveal what it has seen, that holds its secrets without effort, without intention, simply by existing beyond the reach of those who try to understand it. And that is perhaps the most unsettling part of all. Because it means that whatever happened that night is not hidden in a document, not stored in a file, not waiting to be discovered in a forgotten piece of evidence. It is gone, lost in time, carried away by the wind, buried beneath layers of snow, absorbed into a place that does not give anything back. But even so, the story remains. Not because the mountain tells it, but because people do. Because investigators refuse to let it disappear, because researchers continue to study it, because those who hear it cannot ignore it, drawn in by the unanswered questions, by the feeling that something important is still missing. And in that way, the Dyatlov Pass incident has become more than an event. It has become a question that continues to be asked, not just about what happened on that mountain, but about the limits of our ability to understand the world around us. Because we often believe that with enough time, enough effort, and enough evidence, every mystery can be solved. But this case suggests something different. That sometimes the truth exists but remains incomplete. That sometimes we can come close but not all the way. That sometimes understanding stops just short of certainty. And that is where this story ends. Not with a final answer, but with something far more unsettling. The possibility that we already know almost everything that happened, and still do not truly understand it.